Now, I want to tell you about a wedding that happened in the autumn of 1887 in a little church outside Copper Bluff, Montana Territory. And I want you to listen close, because what happened after the vows ain't something anybody in that congregation ever forgot. Mabel Adler had attended 37 weddings in that church. She'd seen brides weep with joy, blush with nerves, and once, Lord have mercy, faint clean away before the preacher got to dearly beloved. But she had never, in all her 62 years, seen a bride shake the way Hazel Brennan shook. The girl was 19, thin as a fence rail, dressed in her dead mother's cotton gown, walking toward the altar like she was walking toward a sentencing. Her eyes never lifted from the floorboards. Her fingers twisted and untwisted at her sides. And every woman in those pews knew exactly why. Silas Hartwell waited at the front. 31 years old, built like a man who'd wrestled stumps from hard ground his whole life, with hands scarred from wire and weather and work that never ended. He'd buried his wife, Clara. 2 years back, fever took her in 3 days, and the whole valley heard the silence that followed. Since then, he'd worked that struggling homestead alone, raising his daughter Daisy with no help and fewer words. The town's verdict was unanimous and final: hard man, silent man, the kind who wore his grief like a locked gate and didn't invite company. Mabel knew the arrangement. Everyone did. Hazel's father owed Silas for a season of lumber and labor, couldn't pay, offered his youngest daughter instead, the way certain men did when they'd run out of currency and conscience both. Hazel hadn't been asked. She'd been informed over supper, between the potatoes and the bread, as if her future were just another item to pass across the table. November cold pressed through the window glass. Frost crept along the sills. Reverend Tucker read the vows, his breath making small clouds in the unheated church. Hazel's voice came out thin as creek water. Silas answered steady and low. And then it was done. But Silas didn't move toward the door. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, careful, the way a man handles something he's thought about for a long time. He held it out to Hazel. She stared at it the way a rabbit stares at an unfamiliar shadow. "Take it," he said quietly. She did. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The congregation leaned forward as one body. Mabel Adler put on her spectacles and squinted hard. It was a deed. 10 acres of good bottomland along the creek, filed and recorded at the county office, the ink still sharp. And the name on the deed wasn't Silas Hartwell. It was Hazel Brennan, her name, her land, hers alone. The church went silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, like snow before it falls. Then the gasps came, rolling through the pews like wind through dry wheat. Silas looked at his bride. His voice was low enough that only the front rows caught it, but Mabel heard every word and carried them with her the rest of her life. "If you ever want to leave," he said, "you'll have ground to stand on. No woman should stay because she's got nowhere to go." Hazel's lips parted. No sound came out. She looked at the paper, then at him, then at the paper again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something she could understand. They didn't. The deed said what it said. Silas offered his arm. She took it not because she trusted him, but because her legs weren't steady enough to walk on their own. They stepped out into the cold November air, and the congregation sat stunned behind them, whispering like a hive that's been knocked from its branch. Mabel Adler lowered her spectacles and said to no one in particular, "Well, I never." She hadn't. None of them had. The cabin was smaller than Hazel expected. 2 rooms and a loft, rough-hewn logs chinked with river clay, a porch that sagged toward the east where the rain hit hardest. The hearth held barely enough ember to keep the chill from settling permanent into the walls. The whole place smelled of pine sap, cold ash, and the faint sweetness of dried straw. Silas carried her bag inside and set it by a door she hadn't noticed at first narrow, set back from the main room, with hinges that looked newly oiled. He opened it without ceremony. Beyond was a small room, a narrow bed with a quilt folded tight at the foot, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that faced the tree line where the last light was dying between the pines. Clean, spare, prepared. And on the inside of the door a lock, a bolt lock, iron, mounted with screws still bright from the hardware store, new deliberate. "This is Silas said. "Nothing more." Hazel stepped across the threshold. Her fingers found the bolt before she found the bed. Cool iron. Solid. The kind of mechanism that doesn't stick or slip. She could lock this door and no man alive could open it without splitting the frame. Her father's house had no locks on the bedroom doors. She remembered the sound of his boots in the hallway at night, heavy, unsteady after whiskey, stopping outside her door with a thud that made the floorboards creak. He never came in, but the absence of a lock meant the possibility lived in every silence, and she'd learned to sleep with her shoes on, just in case she needed to run. From the hallway, she heard Silas kneel, the creak of his weight settling, his voice, low and patient, speaking to someone small. "Daisy, listen to me now. Miss Hazel's got her own room. We knock before we go in. Always. You hear me? Always." The child's voice was high, earnest, a little breathless. Always, every single time. "Even if I want to show her my drawings, even then, button. You knock and you wait." A pause. Then, with the gravity only a 4-year-old can muster, "Yes, Papa." Hazel sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with fresh straw. She could smell it, clean and sun-dried. The scent of someone's forethought. Someone had aired this before she arrived. Someone had considered what a stranger might need to feel less like a stranger. She turned the lock. The bolt slid home with a sound like a sentence ending. Final. Sure. She sat in the quiet of a house where no one shouted, where a man knelt on a wooden floor and taught his 4-year-old daughter the meaning of a closed door, where the only sounds were wind pressing against glass, the far-off settling of embers, and a child's bare feet padding toward the loft. Before she blew out the candle, Hazel opened the deed one more time, unfolded it in the dim, guttering light, her name, written in a county clerk's careful hand. She traced the letters with her fingertip, Hazel, as if confirming she was real. She folded it back, placed it in the washstand drawer, closed it, not ready to trust, but for the first time, unable to dismiss. Silas didn't sleep that night. He lay on the bench in the main room, a wool blanket pulled to his chest, one hand resting flat against the rough pine as if steadying himself against something only he could feel. The cabin ticked and settled around him. Wind found the gaps in the chinking, and from behind the closed door the sound of a bolt sliding shut. His thumb pressed hard into the wood grain, then released. Good. The lock meant it was working. He thought of Clara, not the fever he'd trained himself away from those 3 brutal days, but the years before. Her laugh, bright as tin in sunlight, the way she'd called him Bear because he was large and quiet and slow to anger. She'd married him willing. She'd stayed because she wanted to. She'd died before he could say one more time that she was the whole and entire of his world. Now there was a girl behind that door who couldn't meet his eyes. 19 years old, hands that shook like aspen in a crosswind. He knew that tremor. He'd grown up watching it. His mother, Ruth Hartwell, married at 17 to Abner Hartwell, who never struck her and never let her leave. No land in her name, no money of her own, no family within 300 miles willing to take her in. She'd stayed because staying was the only door open to her, and year by slow year, she'd faded, like cloth left in the weather, like a lamp with no one to fill it. Her voice got quieter, her step got slower, her eyes stopped looking for anything at all. She died when Silas was 14, quietly, the way women like Ruth died without permission and without protest, as if the world barely noticed the difference. He'd stood at her grave in a suit that didn't fit and made a vow so deep it settled into his bones like a second skeleton if he ever married again. His wife would stay by choice. He would build her a door she could lock. He would give her land to stand on, and he would never raise his voice. Not once, not ever. The embers popped and shifted. The wind pressed. Behind the door, Hazel breathed slow, uneven. The breathing of a woman who wasn't sleeping either. Silas rose in the dark. He moved to the hallway on stockinged feet, making his steps deliberately soft, not sneaking, but choosing gentleness the way another man might choose volume. He set the oil lamp on the hall table and turned the wick low, just enough light so that if she woke in an unfamiliar place, she wouldn't wake in darkness. Then he went back to the bench, pulled the blanket up, closed his eyes. He would not explain himself. He would show her, one day at a time, until the showing was enough or until she took her 10 acres and left. Either way, she'd go with ground beneath her feet. That much he owed to Ruth. 2 weeks passed, and Hazel learned the rhythms of the Hartwell homestead, the way a person learns a foreign tongue by watching, listening, keeping her mouth shut until the sounds began to make sense. Now, trust don't arrive on horseback. It comes on foot, one careful step at a time, and most days you don't even notice it moving. But it was moving in that cabin, sure as the frost was deepening outside. Silas rose before dawn. She'd hear the door, his boots on the porch, the slow creak of the well handle drawing water. By the time she came to the kitchen, coffee was warming on the stove and he was already gone to the barn or the far field, working the land with a patience that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than stubbornness. He never asked her to cook. She cooked anyway because doing nothing felt worse than doing wrong. He ate whatever she made without complaint, said, "Much obliged," the same whether it was good biscuits or scorched porridge, and cleared his own plate to the wash bucket every time. "You don't have to do that," Hazel said one morning, watching him scrape his dish. "I can wash up." "I know you can," Silas said, "but I've been doing it 4 years. Hands don't know how to stop." It was the most words he'd offered at one time. She didn't know what to do with them. So she nodded and turned back to the stove. But something in her chest eased a 1/4 inch, like a knot that nobody had touched deciding on its own to loosen. Daisy was the true bridge. The child was 4. All elbows and tangled hair and a laugh that could split winter open like kindling. She brought Hazel offerings with the solemnity of a deacon passing the plate a dried wildflower, brown and brittle, a creek stone, smooth as soap, a magpie feather, gray and white. But it was what Daisy did on the 3rd Sunday that caught Hazel off guard. The girl came to the table for breakfast carrying a tin plate, and instead of setting it at her own place, she set it across from Silas where Clara's chair had been, empty for 2 years. "That's Mama's spot," Daisy said. Matter of fact, Silas went still, then, gently, "Button, why don't you set that plate next to yours, for Miss Hazel?" Daisy considered this. "But ain't she sitting in Mama's place now?" "No, sweetheart, she's sitting in her own place. We're going to make one just for her." He moved the chair 6 inches to the left, opening a new space at the table, a small thing. But Hazel understood what it cost him, that 6 inches between memory and the present, between honoring the dead and making room for the living. She sat in her own chair, not Clara's, hers, that Friday. Daisy asked Hazel to read her a bedtime story. Hazel glanced at Silas. He was oiling a hinge by the fire. He looked up, gave a single nod, the choice entirely hers, and returned to his work. Hazel read. Daisy fell asleep before the 2nd page, warm against her shoulder, one small fist curled in the fabric of Hazel's dress. She sat there longer than the story required, the weight of the sleeping child pressed against her ribs, not the weight that traps, but the kind that holds a drifting boat to shore. Now, you need to understand something about Hazel Brennan. In 19 years of living, she had never once sat beside a man and felt safe. Not her father, who sold her for lumber. Not her brothers, who studied the wallpaper while it happened. She had learned before she had language for it that men were weather you didn't trust weather. You survived it, and you kept your shoes by the bed in case you had to run. So when the blizzard sealed them inside for 3 days in mid-December, she braced for what close quarters always meant. Tension, volatility, the slow tightening of air in a room with no exits. The air didn't tighten. First night, Silas read to Daisy by lamplight, some tattered book about a rabbit and a garden, the spine cracked from years of small hands. He did the rabbit's voice high enough to make Daisy shriek with laughter, and when the child demanded he do it again, he did patient as sunrise, as if he had nowhere else in the world to be. Hazel stood in her doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching. He never looked up, never beckoned, just kept reading, the way he did everything, leaving space for her to choose. Second night. She moved to the chair near the hearth. The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters, piling snow against the door. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether she wanted one. Set the tin cup on the table between them. She picked it up. They sat in silence while the fire popped and the wind screamed and Daisy slept in the loft above. The quiet between them had changed. It used to be the silence of strangers sharing a stagecoach. Now it was something else, the silence of two people who didn't need to fill the room to be in it together. Her hands didn't shake. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of pain after carrying it so long you forgot it was there. She held the cup and her fingers were steady and still. And the steadiness mattered more than any words she'd ever been told about safety or home. "Coffee's good tonight," she said. "Same as always," Silas said. "Strong enough to float a horseshoe. That ain't a recommendation." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt it in her chest, something cracking open, not breaking, thawing, the way ice sounds along a creek edge when the worst of winter finally starts to pass. Third evening. Daisy climbed down from the loft for supper and reached across the table for Hazel's hand. Small fingers, fever warm, curling around hers with the absolute confidence of a child who hasn't learned to doubt. Hazel let her. She let her hold on through the blessing and the eating and the clearing of plates. And when Daisy finally released her to climb back to the loft, the absence of that small hand felt louder than the storm. Silas watched his daughter hold Hazel's hand. His jaw worked once, tight, and he looked down at his plate as if the beans required his full attention. After Daisy slept, Hazel lingered near the fire. 2 words. That was all she could find. "Thank you." Silas nodded. He didn't ask what for. They both understood it was everything: the coffee and the quiet and the space and the door and the deed and the 4-year-old girl who reached without asking permission. Because her father had taught her that reaching was safe. The hearth was fully lit now, both of them tending it. There were things Silas Hartwell kept in the barn that didn't belong to the land. A carved wooden box, small enough to rest in one palm, sat on the high shelf behind the tack where the shadows were deepest. Dogwood flowers cut into the lid, rough but careful, the work of a boy's hands learning what they could do with a knife and patience. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't needed to. What was inside stayed sharp regardless. But Hazel found it, late January. She'd gone to the barn for the pitchfork, and her eye caught the carving in a slant of winter light. She reached for it the way a person reaches for something beautiful before thinking whether they should. The clasp on the locket inside was stiff. She pressed it. A face looked back at her. A woman. Not old, maybe 35, but worn past her years the way certain women got worn. From the inside out, pale hair pulled tight, a jaw that might have been strong once, and eyes that held the kind of tired that sleep couldn't touch, the kind that settled in when hope packed its bags and left without saying goodbye. Hazel brought the locket to the cabin. Daisy saw it first. "That's Grandma Ruth," the child said. "Plain as weather. Papa says she was real tired." Hazel waited. She let 2 days pass, 2 days of chores and meals, and the ordinary rhythm of a homestead in deep winter before she set the locket on the table after Daisy's bedtime. She needed Silas to know this wasn't ambush. It was asking. He went still when he saw it. His hands, which had been wrapping a cracked harness strap, stopped moving entirely. One finger drifted toward the locket, hovered, then settled beside it on the table. He didn't open it. His knuckles whitened around the harness leather. "Tell me," Hazel said. 2 words, the most she'd ever asked of him. And here's what nobody in that town knew about Silas Hartwell. The deed at the wedding wasn't generosity. The lock on the door wasn't kindness. They were promises made to a woman who'd been in the ground for 17 years and never had either one. "Her name was Ruth," he said. His voice dropped into a register Hazel hadn't heard before, lower, rougher, as if the words were coming up from somewhere he didn't visit often. "Married my father at 17. He wasn't a cruel man. I want you to know that. Never raised a hand to her, not once, but he never gave her nothing that was hers, neither. No land, no money she could reach, no way out if she wanted one." He turned the locket over in his scarred fingers. Didn't open it. She faded. That's the only word I got for it. Like something left too long in the weather, every year. A little less of her. By the time I was 12, she barely spoke above a whisper. She'd sit in the kitchen with her hands in her lap and stare out the window like she was watching for someone who was never going to come. "When did she pass?" Hazel asked softly. "I was 14. Doctor said her heart gave out." He paused. his thumb pressed against the locket's hinge. I reckon her heart gave out long before that day. Hazel looked at the tarnished portrait. The woman's eyes. She knew those eyes. She'd seen them in the mirror above her father's washstand every morning for 19 years, the expression of someone who'd stopped expecting anything and received exactly that. "She looks tired," Hazel whispered. "She was," Silas said. The silence between them held the weight of 2 lifetimes. 2 days later, after Silas had gone out to check the cattle in a freezing rain, and Hazel had spent the afternoon teaching Daisy how to roll biscuit dough. The question that had been building since the locket finally arrived. They were at the table. Daisy was asleep in the loft. The lamp burned low and steady between them, casting their shadows long against the cabin wall. "The deed," Hazel said. "The lock, all of it. It was for her, wasn't it?" It wasn't a question. Silas heard that and respected it by answering plain. "I was 14 when she died. Stood at her grave in a suit my uncle lent me, and I swore something I ain't never told another soul." He looked at Hazel across the lamplight. "I swore that if I ever married again, my wife would stay by choice. Not because she was stuck, not because the law said she was mine, not because she didn't have nowhere else to be." He set his coffee down. "I didn't know if I'd ever marry again after Clara. Didn't plan on it. But when your father came to me with his debt and his offer," the word twisted in his mouth like something sour, "I knew if I said no, he'd find someone else, someone who wouldn't think about locks or deeds or what a woman needs to feel like a person instead of property. So you said yes." "I said yes, and I filed that deed the same day." Hazel sat with this. The fire popped. Outside, the freezing rain ticked against the glass like fingernails, and the dark pressed close around the cabin, making the lamplight feel like the only warm thing left in the territory. "Your mother," Hazel said. "She never had a deed. She never had nothing. Not 1 acre, not $1, not one door she could lock." His voice held steady, but his hands didn't. His fingers wrapped around the coffee cup with a grip that turned his knuckles pale. "I watched her disappear. Hazel, inch by inch, year by year. And there wasn't a thing I could do about it, because I was a boy, and the law was the law, and a wife belonged to her husband, the way a horse belonged to a barn." It was the first time he'd said her name. Not Miss Hazel, not Mrs. Hartwell, just Hazel. The sound of it in his low voice undid something in her she hadn't known was still fastened shut. She went to her room, not fleeing, walking steady, carrying the weight of what she'd heard. She closed the door, didn't lock it. She opened the drawer. The deed lay folded exactly as it had been since November. She pressed her thumb along the familiar crease. 10 acres. Good bottom land, creek water, enough to build on, plant on, live on, enough to walk away from any man and never look back. She could leave. The truth of it sat solid and immovable as stone. Silas Hartwell had made certain of that before he'd known her well enough to say her name soft. But the question had changed. It had been changing for weeks, shifting under the surface like a creek finding a new channel. It used to be, "Can I go?" Now it was simply, "Do I want to stay?" She thought of Daisy's hand at supper. Coffee set on a table without conditions, a rabbit voice by lamplight, a boy at his mother's grave making a promise he'd carried for 17 years and delivered to a stranger because keeping it mattered more than being understood. Hazel pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The tears came from somewhere below, language hot, silent, the kind that don't ask permission and don't explain themselves. Not fear. She was finished with that particular weeping. This was something else. Grief for Ruth, who never had a deed. Gratitude for the son who made sure the next woman would. She closed the drawer, didn't take the deed out, didn't pack. She lay in bed and listened to the cabin breathing around her. Silas checking the fire one last time. His footsteps deliberately soft in the hall. Daisy turning in the loft, murmuring something about biscuits. Wind and rain and the creak of good timber holding steady against the dark. This is what a home sounds like, she thought, and for the first time since the wedding, she didn't turn the lock. March came muddy and raw, the way it always does in Montana, winter not yet finished, but spring shouldering its way through regardless, stubborn as a woman who's made up her mind. The creek ran high and loud, Fence posts leaned where frost heave had shoved them crooked. Everything smelled of wet earth and thaw and the green determination of things deciding to live. Hazel brought water to Silas in the field without being asked. She didn't think about it, just filled the canteen, crossed the muddy ground past the barn, and held it out. Their fingers touched on the tin his rough, hers rougher now than they'd been in November, calloused from wood and iron and the honest work of keeping a homestead upright. Neither of them pulled away. A small thing, the size of a creekstone or a magpie feather, but it carried the weight of every small thing that had come before it, every cup of coffee, every knocked-upon door, every silence that chose kindness over demand. "Much obliged," Silas said, but his eyes stayed on her a beat longer than they used to, as if he was reading something in her face he'd been afraid to look for. "Fence is leaning bad on the south side," Hazel said. "I seen it. I can hold the posts if you reset 'em." He looked at her. "You sure ground's still half froze?" "I've got gloves, and I ain't made of paper." That almost smile again. Closer to real this time. "No, ma'am, I reckon you ain't." They worked the fence line together through the afternoon, Hazel bracing each post while Silas tamped the earth. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The work itself was a conversation, rhythm, and effort, and two people moving in the same direction without needing to be told. That evening, Hazel set 3 places at the table and called out, "Supper's ready, not your supper, not food's on. Just supper," the word of a woman who'd decided this table was hers to set. Silas sat down slower than usual, careful. The way a man sits when he suspects the good thing in front of him might disappear if he breathes too hard. Daisy was telling a long and winding story about the barn cat's adventures, how it had climbed clear up to the hayloft and knocked over the milk pail and then sat there washing its face. "Like it ain't even done nothing wrong, Mama." She stopped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went round and panicked, darting from Hazel to her father and back, the way a child looks when a word slips out that can't be put back. I didn't mean—" The cabin held its breath. Hazel put down her fork. She rose from her chair and knelt beside Daisy slowly, the way you kneel beside something precious that doesn't know its own worth. She took the child's face in both hands, small cheeks, warm skin, eyes bright with worry. "It's all right, sweetheart. You can finish your story." Daisy stared at her, lip trembling. "You ain't mad, not even a little." "Can I call you that for real and true?" Hazel smoothed a tangle of hair from Daisy's forehead. "Only if you want to." Daisy threw her arms around Hazel's neck with the fierce, total grip of a child who has just been given permission to love. Hazel held her. Over the girl's shoulder, she saw Silas turn toward the window, one hand pressed flat across his mouth, his shoulders drawn tight with something he would not let them see. That night, Hazel left her bedroom door open. 3 inches, just a crack. Lamplight spilling into the hallway like a word she wasn't ready to say out loud but couldn't keep inside any longer. Silas passed on his way to the bench. He saw the light. He didn't step closer. He didn't need to. He smiled. April. Spring morning. The kind of light that arrives like forgiveness, warm, unhurried, asking nothing in return. Hazel stood at the washstand in her room, wearing the same cotton dress she'd worn at the altar 5 months ago. Her mother's dress. She was letting out the side seams with a needle and thread, not because the fabric had shrunk, but because she'd grown, eating well, sleeping warm, living in a house that had stopped being someone else's and started being her. She set the needle down and opened the drawer. The deed was there, folded once, soft at the crease where her thumb had traced it a dozen times through the winter. 10 acres, creek bottom land, her name in a county clerk's precise hand. She could still feel the church, the cold glass, the gasps, the folded paper placed into her shaking fingers by a man she'd been terrified to look at. She wasn't shaking now. She kept the deed. She would always keep it. Not because it was her escape she'd known for weeks. It wasn't that anymore, but because it was proof. Proof that a man existed who cared more about her freedom than his own comfort. Who made a vow at 14 to a mother who died without one single thing in her name, and kept that vow with a stranger because the keeping mattered more than being thanked. She closed the drawer, smoothed the dress, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and walked outside. The homestead had transformed, where November had shown her bare trees and frozen mud. April gave her green shoots along the fence line, birdsong from the cottonwoods by the creek, and a sky so deeply blue it looked like something painted by a hand that loved the world. The fence stood straight, they'd mended it together, post by post, the work of two people who'd learned to share labor without being asked. Smoke rose from the chimney behind her, thin and pale against that impossible sky. Silas was at the far fence, replacing a cracked rail. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his hat pushed back, his hands moving with the same deliberate patience she'd watched all winter, the steadiness of a man who'd learned that the best things are built slowly and never forced. Daisy was beside him, picking wildflowers, real ones alive with color, purple and yellow and white, clutched in a small fist like a bouquet meant for a queen. "Mama!" Daisy shouted, spotting Hazel across the yard. "Mama, look what I found!" The word flew across the spring air like a bird that had finally been let out of a cage. It didn't stumble. It didn't apologize. It simply was. Hazel crossed the yard. Her steps were steady. Her hands were still. She reached Silas. He straightened, set down the hammer, pushed his hat back, looked at her the way he always did, patient, careful, ready to give her room, ready. Even now, for her to turn away if she needed to, she took his hand. He looked down at her fingers laced through his, her hands rough now, calloused and capable, the hands of a woman who'd chosen this land and this labor and this life. Something moved across his face, a loosening, a release. The last locked gate inside him swinging open on hinges he'd oiled but never believed he'd use. And for the first time since she'd known him, Silas Hartwell smiled, not a nod, not that guarded expression she'd spent 5 months learning to read. A real smile, full and unheld, the kind that rewrites a man's whole face and tells you everything his silence has been keeping safe. Daisy ran to them, flowers in one hand, the other reaching up. Hazel took it, 3 of them standing at the fence line. Spring light, wildflowers. The cabin behind them with its chimney sending warm smoke into a blue and merciful sky. Silas Hartwell gave his bride 10 acres and the right to walk away. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere to go, but because she'd finally found somewhere worth being. And if you ask me, that's the only kind of love that lasts.